Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for tuning in to this webinar. Big thank you to Color of Change, Working Families Power, and ACLU for bringing us together to come have a conversation about the power of the prosecutor. So my name is Insha Rahman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel: Rachel Marshall, Jose Bernal, Kiana Johnson, and Monique Worrell. So before I turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves, say a few words, I want to start by just telling you a little bit about me and what I hope we get out of today's conversation. So I'm now at the Vera Institute of Justice. We're a national organization that works to end mass incarceration, restore dignity to people behind bars, and fight for safe, thriving communities. But before that, I spent many years as a public defender in the Bronx, New York. And as a public defender, standing there in court, often having to negotiate with prosecutors across the aisle for what at times was, somebody's liberty, somebody's livelihood, someone's well-being. You just have this sort of immense sense of how small you feel and how powerful prosecutors feel. And that's a sense. And the truth is, that's actually not a reality, because when we hold prosecutors accountable, when we elect prosecutors who actually reflect the will of communities that care more about people in the system and making sure that we do everything we can to prevent crime and respond to crisis and stop violence instead of seek punishment and a conviction, there's actually a lot of good that prosecutors can do. And I'll share this as a former public defender, sort of once a defender, always a defender, I'm going to always have a little bit of skepticism about prosecutors. And I think that that skepticism is A-okay, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is power and using power for good and not harm, as too often for many, many years, decades, a prosecutor's office has often done in our communities. And so as we get into this conversation, what I'm excited for us to talk about is how do we elect and get prosecutors who actually reflect the will of communities that are truly reform-minded? How are those the folks who are in power? And when they are in power, how do we make sure they use that power for good, accountability? And so this is called Power of the Prosecutor. I'd say the subtitle of this is really the power of the people, and making sure prosecutors do right by communities and are accountable in all the ways that we care about accountability. So let's dive in, and I'll go around, and each panelist, I'd love for you to say who you are, where you are, and what do you do in this space, so folks have a sense of what you're bringing to this conversation. And Jose, let me start with you. And Jose is the organizing director at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. Jose, over to you. Tell us about you, who you are, what you do in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you everyone, for making time to join us here today. My name is Jose Bernal. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the director of organizing at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. We're based in Oakland, California, and I've been organizing for over a decade, both on the inside and on the outside. I'm formerly incarcerated, and a lot of my work focuses on our membership. We have a very robust membership, and it also focuses on local issues, local campaigns, and that includes holding the sheriff and the district attorney accountable. And so that's been a big part of my work. Also, I lead our civic engagement work and our political work. And so very honored to be here with an amazing group of panelists and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks so much, Jose. Kiana Johnson, let me turn it over to you. Kiana is the founder of Life After Release. Kiana, tell us about yourself. What do you do in this space?
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Kiana Johnson. My pronouns are she, her. And I am the founder and executive director of Life After Release, an organization that is based in Prince George's County, Maryland. And we are organizing to build a post-conviction movement, identifying challenges and creating solutions within the criminal legal system. Our work is grounded in a vision for self-determination for directly impacted communities. And we have a very strong way of holding prosecutors accountable through our advocacy work, our court watching work, our participatory defense work, and where we understand, and myself particularly as a formerly incarcerated woman, the absolute power that prosecutors have and the ways that we, the people, one, need to be aware of that, and two, ways in which we can start to impact and have change around the prosecutor's office.
Thanks, Kiana. And then, we want to make sure that we have a discussion tonight where we're hearing from a number of different perspectives around the power of the prosecutor. And so Rachel Marshall, who's the executive director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College, worked at a prosecutor's office, knows this field intimately. Rachel, tell us about yourself and what you do in this field.
Thanks so much, Insha, and thank you all for having me and everyone watching. And Insha, like you said, once a public defender, always a public defender. And I actually started as a public defender myself. I worked as a public defender in Oakland for about 9 years. And I really did experience, as you said, the power of the prosecutor and the helplessness I sometimes felt on behalf of my clients in watching prosecutors not have a full sense of what the community needed, what my clients needed. And so when Chesa was elected district attorney in San Francisco, I began working with him as his director of communications and policy advisor, where, for those who don't know, we saw a lot of fear mongering around criminal justice reform that he was implementing and a false narrative. And ultimately, he was recalled. And now I'm fortunate enough to run the IIP, which works with prosecutors, experts, key stakeholders to bring everyone together and develop evidence-based strategies to building safe communities and promoting justice. So we hold convenings, we put out publications, we build strong relationships with prosecutors and community members, and really try to educate the public on the benefits of prosecutorial reform as well. So really excited to be here and for this conversation.
Thanks, Rachel. And last but not least, State Attorney Monique Worrell, State Attorney from, tell me the county. Again, I'm so sorry. I'll let you fill that in. But for many of you, you know Monique, and you know the incredible battle she's waging right now against sort of the thwarting the power of prosecutors. So we're very lucky to have her perspective in this. It's Orlando, Florida. Tell me the jurisdiction. I'm sorry. But over
That's okay. Thank you so much, Insha. And good evening, everyone. It is truly an honor to be with you. As Insha said, I'm Monique Worrell, the elected state attorney here in Orlando, Orange, and Osceola counties. You might have gotten the Orange, but the Osceola is a little tough for most people. Here in Florida, where all of the bad things happen first before they go everywhere else in the country, unfortunately. So for those who don't know, I am the elected state attorney, and the reason I use the term elected before state attorney is because there are currently 2 state attorneys here in my jurisdiction. I, the elected one, and another guy who will remain nameless, the appointed one. And he was appointed by the governor when I was removed from my office unjustly back in August. And the reason that I was removed is because I actually upheld my campaign promises. When I told my community and my constituents that I was going to reduce crime and mass incarceration, I meant it, and I did it. And the leading line in the governor's executive order suspending me is that I incarcerated fewer people than any other jurisdiction across the state. So I wear that as a badge of honor as a former public defender turned prosecutor, that I was able to actually say what I meant and meant what I said when I was on the campaign trail. And I think that that's really important when it comes to holding people accountable is looking at what promises they make and how good they do in fulfilling those promises. Here in the state of Florida, it's a battle. Progressive prosecution, criminal justice reform is a battle, and one that I have signed up to fight yet again.
Thanks for that, Monique. And as you can see, there's just an incredible diversity of expertise and experience and perspective in this panel. And I'm really excited for us to dig in. Before I start with the first question, one of the things I want to say is part of the reason we wanted to make sure we have somebody who is an elected state attorney, elected prosecutor, folks who work to hold prosecutors accountable at the local level, folks who work with prosecutors to make sure that they're using their power for good, is that ecosystem where there's different lanes and each one of them are really important is very clear in this moment where prosecutors are under attack across the country if they run on campaign promises where I am not just about safety, but I am also about justice, and actually make good on caring about things like racism and addressing inequity and responding to what the communities who put them in office want. And Monique, your story is such a powerful example of, how we need to keep building power so that we can protect the prosecutors who are doing right. And we also need power to make sure that prosecutors who aren't doing right are held accountable. And, one of the things that is really powerful about this movement for me being at Vera, where our role in it is that we work with elected prosecutors across the country to actually change policy and practice and culture within their offices, and then through our C4 arm, help to shape the narrative around what prosecutors should be doing and how do we counter the backlash, all the attacks of Soros-funded prosecutors or prosecutors who are soft on crime. And, what we know from the other folks who are here is, like, how do we get a full sense of that ecosystem and where do we need to keep investing, working together, collaborating, and folks like Working Families and Color of Change, ACLU, between all of us work on the electoral side, on the side of accountability, on the side of sort of growing power, base building, organizing. So I just want to be really clear that that's why you're seeing this diversity of perspective on this call, is because each lane in that ecosystem is necessary and important and vital. Folks within, folks without, folks pushing, folks holding folks accountable, like all of that is just so important to this. So that helps to sort of turn to the first question, and any of you please jump in if you feel inspired with an answer, which is, why should there actually be a specific focus on prosecutor-related advocacy and strategy? And what does the reform-minded prosecutor movement refer to? What does it actually mean for you from where you sit in the ecosystem and the work you do? Anyone want to take that first? All right. Yeah, go for it, Rachel. I was about to start voluntolding people. Go for it.
I'll save everyone from that. So I think, as I think we all touched upon at some level, prosecutors have immense power in the legal system, more so than really any other player. And when that power can be harnessed to correct a lot of the injustices in the system, that's incredibly powerful. So I'm delighted and that prosecutors are really leaders in many ways in the criminal justice reform movement now, and that there's a real understanding of how they can and should be using that power proactively. I think at the same time, I worry a little bit about calling it a reform-minded movement, as much as I've been guilty of doing that a lot. And the reason is a fewfold, actually. One is that I think that the movement has been so successful in some ways that a lot of reforms are being implemented in prosecutors' offices who would never consider themselves reformers, whether you know it or not. And so I think there's an opportunity for a lot of that work to continue. And if we limit it and say, progressive prosecutors, reform-minded prosecutors, I worry that it limits the reach of some of those reforms, and folks who are in other offices are going to say, that's not for me. So that's one of the concerns that I have about holding people to litmus tests, or suggesting that there's a limited movement as opposed to an understanding that actually reform is part of prosecutors' work and part of their job.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I'm curious to hear if others agree or disagree with that, sort of the potential danger or sort of exclusion of using a term like reform-minded prosecution or progressive prosecutors, or sort of like trying to draw a narrow sort of like cordon around who is a reform-minded prosecutor or not. So Kiana, can I ask you to weigh in? Sort of, what do you see as the reform-minded prosecutor movement, and how do you feel about that term? Do you think there's a value to identification or not? And also, given especially the accountability work you all do, like, Do you think that sort of specific focus on prosecutor-related advocacy and strategy is important?
Absolutely, it is very much so important. The biggest problem I have with it is that to call a prosecutor, it's making the prosecutor sort of like the heroes in the work. And so the focus of progressive prosecutors, reform-minded prosecutors, and having these platforms, which a lot of the times is could be used as a maybe as like a shadow, or something that a coattail, if you would, if that the prosecutors use, to get folks to elect them into office. And so I'm always very mindful when I hear people using those key terminologies, because I really want to see the records. And that is why in our organization, and why I'm such a strong advocate around Court Watch, because there isn't enough numbers for us to be able to measure the work of prosecutors when we start calling them prosecutors that are reformed or progressive. There's really no reports that they have to tell us, like how they're doing in that area. Thanks for Color of Change having a report card for us to be able to score some of the top prosecutors in the area. But overall, there is really a way, not a way for us to really check in on that. And so I just want, as we are talking about these movements, I want us to talk less and to do more around accountability and advocacy that we can actually see in numbers. So I just wanted to kind of like name that as we're talking about the progressive prosecutor, and understanding that I am more of a public defender fan. So I want to see more of the public defenders being lifted up in this movement, because they should be, instead of all of that power kind of, landing and living with the prosecutor.
Well, what I find so interesting about those two answers, both of whom I bet there are people on this call who agree with one or the other, or maybe even both, is that there is the danger of progressive prosecutor and that moniker being a cover where prosecutors might not actually be all that progressive, but if they get labeled so, they feel like they have free rein to not do as much as they promised to do on the campaign trail. And then also, Rachel, to your point of calling somebody progressive or reform-minded, maybe in a jurisdiction where that's actually seen as an insult or a word used to sort of tar a particular candidate, that it actually might not be helpful for us in the movement to call somebody a reform prosecutor or progressive prosecutor. We have like concrete examples of where that's come up in Utah, places where people don't usually think of any candidates as progressive. There was a DA for one term who embodied for Utah some more reform-minded policies, and then basically had that used against him when he was running for re-election and lost. So like it's really complicated, right? But Kiana, I think your point is so real of there's a worry about cover and letting people off the hook for real accountability as well. Monique, would love to hear your perspective on this. And then Jose, please, I saw you unmute, so go dig in.
Yes, I would love to jump in there. Thank you. So I'll tell you that in Florida, the term progressive or reform prosecutor is a target. And I saw a map at the beginning of the year in 23, where some party had created this map of reform prosecutors, and they had X's on them as if it was their intention to ensure that those prosecutors were eliminated and removed. The governor of Florida actually used that as a talking point on his campaign trail, bragging about the fact that he had removed two of those Soros-backed, progressive prosecutors. I saw something on the news yesterday that talked about rogue prosecutors. So what I found myself doing is using those words less. And to Kiana's point, doing the work and letting people check my work and worrying less about the terminology that was used to describe my work, because in some groups it was looked at with cynicism, right? You say you're a progressive, show us. And then in other groups, it was looked at as, oh, you're one of those people, we're going to target you. So I think that it's really important to let people's actions speak for themselves, ensuring that we have a whole understanding of the process. And I hope we'll have some time to explore that a little bit. later in the discussion, but letting people's work speak for themselves and not putting labels for all of the reasons that have been mentioned thus far.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think the term progressive or reform-minded prosecutor is a fairly new concept, that we're grappling with, and I think it's subjective. And I'll use a very real, concrete example. In San Francisco, there was a district attorney, George Gascon, who, by all accounts, and I am from San Francisco. When I was there, we didn't really consider him a progressive district attorney. But then he moved to Los Angeles, ran for DA, and now he's considered a progressive district attorney. And similarly, I can tell you the former district attorney in Alameda County in Oakland, that person, we never considered them nowhere near reform minded. But if they were to move to a very conservative state, I think most people would consider them progressive. And so I think there's some political nuances with the term. But ultimately, I think to Monique's point, it's about the work. It's about what are you doing to bring people home? What are you doing to end mass incarceration? What are you doing to stop the racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system? And I want to go back a little bit to something you said, Insha, because around our movement, our work, and what we're doing. And at the Ella Baker Center and at the Alameda County District Attorney Accountability Table, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we're not really interested in protecting prosecutors. We see prosecutors, even if they're reform-minded, well-meaning, we care more about the issues, right? That's what matters to us. And so it doesn't matter who holds that office. It's about the issues. It's about the policies, the concrete policies, and that's what we're going to throw down for. That's what we're going to back, not so much the office or the individual. So I just want to put that out there.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please, Rachel.
So I think that's all true, Jose, but I think one of the things that I see is that the prosecutors individually, and no one can speak to this more than Monique, is become the target themselves personally. And so I think when it's harder sometimes to mobilize people around individual issues. So I think about my experience in San Francisco under Chesa Boudin and working for him and seeing the way it became so personalized and everything and the word reform was weaponized against him without an understanding of he was doing the work and also it was having good results. And that was completely lost because of this target on the individuals. So I think the protection of prosecutors is really about protecting the work. It's about saying, let's keep the focus on these people that are doing good work. Let's keep them in office. And to do that sometimes because the other side is so focused on demonizing individuals to advance their cause of attacking criminal justice reform, that means we actually have to protect some of those individuals.
Yeah, do you want to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that something that we have to grapple and understand is that the district attorney's office, I'm not confused, and a lot of folks in the community are not confused. They are state actors, well-meaning, but they are state actors. And historically, there's been a lot of harm and a lot of distrust that has been built up. And so, again, I go back to the progressive prosecutor, reform-minded prosecutor. That's a new concept that folks are navigating. And I can speak to, for example, Chesa, who I know personally as well, Chesa Boudin, supportive, of the policies he put forward, and also not supportive of some of the policies, he put forward. And I had direct conversations with him about that. And so, I think it's important, to understand that the solution isn't a district attorney. Like if we want to end mass incarceration, that's not the solution. It's a tactic, right? And it doesn't matter who's in that office. We need to make sure that we hold that whole office accountable. And so, that's my point, is that we have to hold the office accountable, and it's less about the individual.
So I think this disagreement about is it the office or how much does the individual prosecutor, because at the end of the day, that is an elected official, how much do they stand in for the office and what protections, if any, are needed, really speaks to this question of what should the dynamic be between the community that elects a prosecutor, not because of that person, but Jose, to your point about the policies and the practices that that person is expected and asked by the community to deliver, and then recognizing the very real realities that Rachel, you are speaking to in working in DA Boudin's office, or Monique, that you know very personally in your role as a state attorney, where it's not just about an office, but it's about you as an elected leader, a politician that faces all the same sort of challenges beyond like the important policies of being a reform prosecutor, but also being an elected leader and a candidate and a politician and facing all of the particular dynamics of that. It's really quite unique in a way that I think many other roles or elected roles are not. And so let me ask this question. And Jose, Kiana, I'd love for you all to go first, since you have such deep experience with court watch, accountability tables, other ways of actually saying it's not about the person, it's about what they do in office and with their power. But what would you say should be the right balance of power and the relationship between the community that elects a prosecutor and the prosecutor themselves? Like, what does that balance look like, ideally, to make sure that we are harnessing power and accountability and real change?
I'll start, and I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that I can think of is the policies for sure. I just want to like say, Jose, that I see both sides as the Rachel and Jose. We definitely have to change the policy on a large scale, that prosecutors' main goal is not to jail someone, and making sure that we are actually honing in on that. But to the point that we were talking about around the relationship between the prosecutor and the people, and some of the policies. One of the ones I wanted to talk about was the conviction integrity units. There was a real uptick in those in certain jurisdictions. And with my work at Life After Release, we really pay attention to post-conviction matters. And the relationship is that I think folks are forgetting that there are about 2.3 million Americans that are actually in cages. And so we can have a real honest conversation and really start with the prosecutors that are coming into office now. But we should also be having the conversation about those prosecutors that were in office when Bush and some of those other presidents were in office, Reagan, Nixon, and others. There's still people sitting in prisons from those administrations. And so we should really be also holding them to account for a lot of the post-conviction matters, and getting folks home, and talking about that in a real way, and having very transparent processes and ways for folks to bring their loved ones home out of cages.
Kiana,
Yeah.
I love, oh, I was just going to say, I really appreciate that point of it's not just what the prosecutor presently does, but how can they use their role to undo some of the harms of previous folks in that role. I think that's a really important point. Jose, I'm sorry I cut you off. Go for it.
Yeah, no worries. And I definitely see the other points, and I think in our movement, there are different folks that play different roles, right? Inside, outside, pressure, and I think, I speak on behalf of the Ella Baker Center, right? And for us, it's really important to have trust in the community. It's really important to have those relationships. And so we're interested in building outside power. Sometimes we play the middle person too, and that's great. In terms of what kind of relationship we should have, I'll just speak from our perspective. Is we're not interested in being close to power. We're interested in holding power accountable and building power. That's what we're interested. And so, in organizing, there's an old school it's called relationship organizing. Which basically you have influence, and that's power. And I'm not dismissing that. That's some folks, some organizations, some groups do that. But I think that the relationship we should have with the district attorney is, being ready to hold them accountable, and also being ready to congratulate them, when they do something good and have their backs. And so, again, a very real concrete example, recently in Alameda County, DA Pamela Price, who's facing a lot of criticism, a lot of pressure, a potential recall, decided not to prosecute kids, and she's keeping true to her promise to not prosecute kids as adults. And so, the DA accountability table, Color of Change, played a big role in this. Put together a press conference, rally, brought the community out, brought speakers, and again, this is an example of us really getting behind the policy right? And when we do that, we're also supporting the candidate. You know, we're also saying, okay, this is what you said you were going to do. As long as you hold true to that, you know, we're going to back the policy that you put out there, and that's how we give you cover. You know, but by that same token, we don't want to give the impression that we're in some kind of relationship with them and we're not going to hold them accountable, because that's not going to happen, progressive or not.
Monique, I feel like that's a really good opening for you, given like what's the relationship that you have with the community that elected you, and also what's the relationship you wish you had, given how tough since last summer it's been after the removal, and you know, still fighting to take back the role that the community elected you to.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a whole lot there. There's a whole lot there to be said. So first, I want to go back a little bit in the conversation to the point that prosecutors, elected DAs, we can't end mass incarceration. Jose, you're absolutely right. That's not within our power to do. To be a prosecutor, we do inflict some of the harm that many of your organizations are trying to stop. When I got into this role, I looked at it as reducing harm. As a defense attorney for 20 years, I saw the harm up close and personal. Having an incarcerated family member myself, I saw the harm up close and personal. So when I ran for state attorney, it wasn't because I believed that I could run on a platform of decarceration or even be successful in decarceration. But I knew that because of the information that I had about the harm that the system imposes, that I could reduce harm. And I want to say that I couldn't always reduce harm. Part of my platform was police accountability. And as a candidate and as a defense attorney, I thought, it was even stronger than thought, right? In myself, I knew that when I was elected and I became the state attorney, that I would be able to hold law enforcement accountable for the harms that they inflicted upon the community. When I became the state attorney, I learned time and time again that I didn't have the power that I thought I had. I'll give you just a couple of short examples. There was an incident where a school resource officer who was a law enforcement officer body slammed a young girl on her head in a school. The video went viral, so many of you may have seen it. You saw her body lifeless hit the floor because she went unconscious after he body slammed her, breaking up a school fight. As a mother of a teenage boy who was in the public school system, I was devastated, I was infuriated, and I wanted to hold that officer accountable. I knew that we were going to prosecute that cop. And when my team investigated and we reviewed what the law said, we found that that officer had essential immunity from prosecution because the tactic that he used was a trained law enforcement technique called a takedown that law enforcement officers use when they are trying to bring someone into submission. And that the legislature in this state did not see fit to implement a different set of rules for officers within a school system dealing with children than they would use on the street dealing with individuals. So while we wanted to charge the officer, there was nothing that I could do. There was nothing that I could charge him with. There was no available law to me because it would have been a battery, right? But you can't bring charges against a law enforcement officer who is in the lawful execution of a legal duty. And because the technique that he used to bring this girl down was a trained law enforcement technique, I could not bring charges against him. So I had to let him go. The community was outraged, and I understood because I was outraged. They blamed me They said that I didn't uphold my promises, that I wasn't doing what I said that I was going to do. So the moral of this story is that in holding people accountable, you have to be very clear on what the law allows and what it doesn't. I had a similar situation where officers tased a young man to death. Again, I was furious. I was upset. There was a call to the home because the young man was in a mental health crisis, called by his family to law enforcement. They came and they did not help. They, in fact, made the situation worse. They antagonized him. They made him act out even more. And then essentially they took him down and they tased him. And then he later had a heart attack and died. The case happened before I became state attorney, but when I became state attorney, the family came in and they asked me to look at it. And we looked at it. My team looked at it. They reviewed the video. They reviewed all the evidence. They reviewed the determination of the prior administration. But ultimately, what I didn't know when I ran and what I learned there was that Florida has a statute that specifically provides immunity, civil and criminal, to a law enforcement officer who uses their taser. So no matter what the consequence of the use of their taser is, if they are using it within the lawful execution of their legal duty, then they are immune from criminal and civil liability. So I could not charge the officers. And again, they blamed me. There were headlines about how I failed the community. There was protests outside my office asking for my recall because I failed the community. So I agree, accountability is necessary, and there should be organizations looking at the work. But what I'm saying is, you have to know the difference between what the prosecutor does or doesn't do because it's not within their authority to do so, and what they don't do just because they don't want to, or what they do because they want to. And those are very real and different things. And I just think it's really important for the organizations who are on the outside rallying the community to make sure that they get it right when they take a position on something.
Hey, Monique, it's really powerful to hear sort of from the inside perspective, like what goes on behind a decision and then how it looks externally. And I gotta say this, as a reformed lawyer, recovering lawyer, there's always this question I have about like, there's the law and then there is what is just and right. And we all know those two things are not one and the same always. And those two examples you point out are where the law and justice are not one and the same. And it really sort of, I think, begs a question. We don't have to answer it here, but I just want to put it out there, which is because an elected prosecutor is also a politician, like, is there value to signaling things, even if you know this isn't something that I can uphold or that will necessarily move forward, but just to be able to use the power of the position to signal, like, I hear you, I care, I will push this as much as I'm able to in that role. But I really raise it to say one of the challenges of prosecutors that I see is that they're lawyers and there is the law, and oftentimes the law is not synonymous with justice at all. So let me move us to the next question. And Monique, I'm going to come back to you first because I know we might lose you pretty soon. So we want to make sure we get your take on this. So, I mean, we've heard a number of different challenges of prosecutors being able to stay in power when they do a lot, maybe not all the right things, but a lot of the right things. Chesa Boudin in San Francisco came up as an example. Monique, you come up as an example as well. And then the challenge and the hardship of actually, once prosecutors are in office, holding their feet to the fire and accountability. And so I would love to hear from each of you is, what do you see? And keep the challenge part, the problem, short, because what we really want to hear is what you think the fix is. But what would you say is the biggest challenge from where you sit in the reform prosecutor movement right now? And what's the fix, the solution that you want to see that you're working on? And so Monique, would love to start with you.
I know you said keep the challenge part short and the solution part longer. I don't know that I have solutions, but I can tell you that the challenge is the law. Going back to the statement that you said, right? The challenge is the law. And in at least one of those cases, that's exactly what the family wanted me to do. They wanted me to file charges anyway, even though I knew that I could not move forward. And as an attorney, as an elected prosecutor, I have an ethical obligation. And in as much as I do not want charges filed against a member of the community who I don't think is guilty of the crime by the book, I can't do that to anyone else. Even if I disagree wholeheartedly with the law, I have to uphold the law. I had someone, say to me in a community meeting once, why don't you put the pictures of law enforcement officers up when you bring charges against them? That's what they do to us. And I said, I'm not here to do to them what they do to us. I'm here to give the law equal application, equal justice. And what I think is right is that we don't put anybody's worst moment on display for the world to see. And I'm not going to do that in any of the cases where I have individuals who have been prosecuted by this office. And any of those individuals include when I have to prosecute law enforcement officers. So the challenges are that the law is not in alignment with what's just all the time. The solution, what I tried to do as state attorney, was draft legislation to fix the law to make it more just. I drafted legislation and sent it to the legislature that when a law enforcement officer abuses their discretion and commits a battery on an individual, that it should be a felony in the same way that a battery on a law enforcement officer is a felony, that they shouldn't just be able to get by with a misdemeanor, that they should be charged in the same way that if someone hits a law enforcement officer, that's a felony because they're a law enforcement officer. If a law enforcement officer uses force or commits a battery against a citizen, and that was not within the lawful execution of a legal duty, that they should be charged with a felony. The legislation went nowhere. I drafted legislation that there should be special laws that apply to children in schools and that they shouldn't have the same freedom to treat children the way they would outside of a school. That legislation went nowhere. So the challenge is the law. The solution is to fix it and to put people in office in the legislature who are interested in actually fixing it.
Well, you started your comments by saying you weren't sure that there's a solution, but I think you actually gave us a very clear one. And I also appreciate the point, Monique, of we won't win if we're on our opposition's playing field. We got to be on our own. So I hear that loud and clear. Rachel, can I go to you with this question of, what do you see as the biggest challenge in the reform prosecutor movement right now? And what would you say the solutions are?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenges have to do with the narrative around criminal justice reform and the attacks that we are seeing against criminal justice reform. And those are manifesting, as we've been talking about, in attacks on prosecutors, whether it's Governor DeSantis removing Monique from office when she was duly elected and was doing the work that her community elected her to do. That we've seen these kinds of undemocratic efforts to remove prosecutors and remove their independence. We're seeing in Georgia, second effort at legislation to try to create a commission to remove prosecutors for their use of discretion. And they're only targeting reform-minded prosecutors. And I should mention, because I don't think it's been said, it's mostly women of color and people of color who are being targeted by a lot of these efforts. So I know we were just talking about Chesa, but so many of these efforts, and particularly in states like Georgia, and Florida, we are seeing Black women in particular being targeted as individuals as an effort to go after reform. But I also think there's a larger problem around messaging and a narrative around even quote unquote progressive places where there's a false sense that reform drives crime that's not supported by evidence. That's actually the contrary. And so I think there's a real messaging challenge. And I know that a lot of us are working to do that. I think the solutions are really hard. We have to win. And I know a lot of us on this call are working all the time on this question of how do we reclaim the narrative? How do we correct this misinformation and disinformation around reform? And I think some of it has to do also with just more communication and collaboration with one another. I think Jose is absolutely right that we have different roles to occupy. I also think there's a real benefit sometimes to collaborating and sharing and listening to one another's perspectives and really strategizing on how we can correct a lot of that narrative in each of our lanes. And so I think that's a really important piece of correcting this.
Thank you for that, Rachel. And some of you might have noticed Monique just dropped. She had to leave early, and she says thank you for having her be part of this really important conversation. To the point about narrative, Rachel, there's actually a lot of good work happening right now on how do we own this narrative. And, we at Vera did some research on how exactly we talk about this movement and what prosecutors do. And one of the sort of interesting findings was everyday people, and we did a national survey, don't necessarily see the job of prosecutors as reform and reforming the system. But what they do see is the prosecutor's job is to act with integrity and to seek justice and the truth and not just a conviction. And that's some of the switch that I think we can make to sort of own the moral higher ground, because I think reform often, it's right now a contested word. It doesn't necessarily have the associations that we know it should have. And so it makes me wonder, and there's, I think, a lot of really valuable research that we need to just at least grapple with and dig into in terms of narrative about what is the way for us to talk about this movement and how do we counter some of the attacks. And just to get specific, there is good tested messaging around how do you counter the Soros-funded prosecutor attacks, the attacks that these are prosecutors who don't care about victims and there will be blood on the streets because of their policies. Actually found really good responses. The challenge is the silence, the noise and the volume from media and other politicians about reform-minded prosecutors is really so much louder than the counter narrative about these are prosecutors elected by communities to reflect the values and the priorities of communities. Jose, can I turn to you to ask that same question about the biggest challenge you see and the fix, the solutions that you want to see?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Rachel on narrative. I think the political climate right now is really, at least in my lifetime, I haven't seen it this bad. And I think there's a effort to really scapegoat, an individual or institutions, and unfortunately, it's the anyone that purports or presents themselves as a reform-minded progressive district attorney, when it comes to public safety, they're the scapegoat. And we saw it with Chesa Boudin. We're seeing it in LA with George Gascon. We see it with DA Pamela Price. They're the scapegoat. And you and I and everyone else here knows that it's illogical to put sole blame or sole responsibility of public safety on a district attorney. We know that there are other factors that play a role. We just got done with, we haven't gotten done. We're still in a pandemic, right? I'm sorry, not pandemic, COVID-19. And we're still grappling with a lot of the things that, cause, issues of folks experiencing poverty, issues of folks not getting their needs met. And all of these things drive crime up. We know that. We also know that cities and counties and states that have tough on crime prosecutors are also dealing, with the same things that we're dealing with in progressive cities, reform-minded cities. But the lesson learned, I think, from Chesa Boudin is that facts, aren't going to win. Like we can throw facts out there all we want, but it's a narrative, and whoever controls the narrative, whoever wins the narrative, that's who wins. And right now, that's our biggest challenge right now is the narrative. And I appreciate the good work of Vera and other organizations and other groups, that are really taking this head on. But it is something that worries me because again, and it's not just with the DA's office. I think there's a lot of local measures, a lot of state ballot measures, a lot of things that are very regressive that are not based on any facts or any data-driven, solutions that are really going to set us back years. And I'll speak to California because again, I'm here in California, but we have something called Prop 47, which is under attack right now, and it really, this is the biggest threat that I see right now. We have a potential ballot measure, that we're going to be fighting. And so, yeah, that's the biggest challenge I see is the narrative. So.
Jose, one thing that I think is so important in what you said is, there's a lot of examples like the Floridas and the Georgias of these regressive, sort of tough on crime rhetoric and, sort of zeitgeist, but it's actually not just the places that we think of as more conservative. It's also the Californias, the New Yorks, and you see it and you feel it sort of in the air. So I think that's a really important point, that there's no place that is immune from that backlash. Kiana, last but not least, what do you see as the biggest challenge? What do you see as solutions?
Yeah, so I was really struggling with that because there's so much, right? There's so many challenges that we face as change agents, as activists, as organizers, folks on the ground, who know exactly, what's going on and know how to get to information. But I landed on data and information being our biggest challenge, and really understanding, what the prosecutors are doing and in what cases. Um, so that's the biggest challenge for me, in not understanding or not being able to know exactly what it is. If a case doesn't make the news, um, then or you're not court watching, or you're not doing participatory defense like we are in Prince George's County in my organization, or you don't have a table like Jose does in California, a prosecutor accountability table, then how are we really measuring our success in these offices, and how are we actually holding them accountable? We don't have the data to do so. In addition to that, I believe that we need to change the actual the makeup of what prosecutors' offices do. We need to flip that on the head and be able to say, okay, how many people did you keep out of jail? How many people went to diversion programs, and start to reward those measures? And when prosecutors do those things, instead of getting, their measure of success is how many people they lock up. That's how they get to the next position, is, how, their caseload and how many people they're able to put into prison or to jail. We need to change that as a people. We need to change it through policy. We need to change it through ensuring that we're able to monitor and measure that. And so that for me, that's always been a big challenge. And as a person who's gone through the system myself, I felt like I was all alone and no one knew what happened in my case, right? Like, how do we understand and get to know those things? So we really do need to find ways to have data and reports that are coming out of the prosecutor's offices so that we can actually see what's going on. And last thing, the line prosecutors. We're talking about the elected ones. They very rarely are the ones going into into the courtrooms. And what we've noticed in our court watching is that our line prosecutor, I mean, our elected DA may say one thing and may have a platform that they ran on, but boy, oh boy, when we get inside and those line DAs are actually handling the case, they have a lot of different views compared to their elected boss or supervisor or person that was in charge. So I also want to just draw that out. I don't think we talk much about the line prosecutors. I heard a lot about the elected, and very rarely are they prosecuting the cases. They're just the ones at the top, the ones whose names goes on the paperwork. But their line prosecutors are the ones that we really need to dig in and hold accountable. And again, how can we do that if we don't have any reporting mechanism or any eyes into the courts to see what they're doing?
So I love that point, both about data and transparency, and then also changing the metrics of what we hold prosecutors to and what success looks like for their office. It's not a conviction, which is the typical measure of success, but another set of metrics, right? And I think that's so powerful. So Kiana, in your remarks, you mentioned two things that I want us to spend a little bit of time hearing more about, because they are not sung nearly enough in all of the conversations we have about prosecutors and accountability, which are the really specific community accountability measures that both you, Jose, you, Kiana, that your organizations run and double down on. And so, Jose, let me start with you in a community accountability table. Will you talk about the community accountability table that you and others run? And what does it look like? How does it work? How would, if there are people listening who are like, I want to do that in my jurisdiction, how would you suggest going about getting started?
Yeah, so we're part of the Alameda County District Attorney Accountability Table, and that really formed very organically some years ago. We were part of another coalition, and part of that, it was called the Justice Reinvestment Coalition. Part of that coalition really wanted to make sure there was a committee, keeping eyes on the district attorney's office, making sure, they were doing what they said they were going to do in terms of things, policies that we were in favor of. And we started meeting regularly as a committee. From that, our partner organization is in here to the Urban Peace Movement really led the creation, formation, and structure of a coalition, which we call the AC DAC, Alameda County District Attorney Accountability Table. And it's a group of different organizations, a group of different, with different opinions, different specialties, different skill sets, some grassroots doing youth work, others doing policy work, others, doing legal work. And we all have one common goal, and that's in our name, is holding the district attorney accountable and advancing our values and our mission, to bring our folks home, to make sure that we chip away at the racial disparities that are happening in our injustice system. And so we meet monthly. We can always meet more frequently. I think we meet every other month, not every other week now. We were meeting weekly. And there are committees that are set up in each that are, like, for example, outreach committee, a comms committee, and we also hold like stakeholder meetings with the district attorney's office. And again, those can vary depending on what the needs are at the moment, or what's happening. But that's an opportunity for us to sit at the table with the district attorney's office, with the DA themselves, and really, ask the hard questions, and also look for ways that we could support. So it's not just, hey, we just want to tell you you're not doing this right. That, like, it's also like, okay, you have this policy coming up, and how can we be supportive because we support this policy? Or, hey, like, there's this information that we really need. Can you provide this information for us? And I think that's really what the name, DA Accountability Table, because that's really what it is, us sitting at the table. And I will say that, we've had the table under two district attorneys, one that was not at all reform minded, and the current one who's more reform minded. And I think, for both of them, I think we've tried to hold the line of not really making it about the person. Again, I'll go back to that, but about the office, and so. And obviously, one is definitely more favorable, to the issues and the things that we're trying to push. But yeah, that's been our experience with the district attorney accountability table. And just to be fully transparent, I think that there are some nuances, in trying to hold a district attorney accountable, at the same time understanding that there's a potential recall, looming. And so we don't want to we want to draw the line where we don't want to give the how do I say, the far right, we don't want to give them any more reason, and so there's some nuance in there, but ultimately our mission is to hold the district attorney accountable.
Jose, I think something that is very clear in how you describe the accountability table and the role of it is, we say often in movement spaces, like, we move at the speed of trust. And you got to have a relationship to have a relationship. And with a DA, I mean, something I'm hearing very clearly is like ongoing communication, like for the good things, for the bad things, but like that's part of trust and part of being able to then be able to leverage that power and that relationship that you have. Kiana, you mentioned Court Watch a number of times and would love to hear what Court Watch is, how does it work, and how does it add to, sort of like the eyes on the ground and in the courtroom, the day-to-day, the line prosecutors, like, it's so unique for that. So say a little bit about how it works in your county, because it's a really pretty remarkable Court Watch program that you have.
Yes, thank you so much. We started Court Watch actually when I was working with an organization, Progressive Maryland, and we were running a campaign around a progressive prosecutor. And as an impacted person, I just didn't know what that could mean. And I had questions, and we were asking on the forum, on the questionnaire that we had for the prosecutor, exactly, to tell us what they would do if they got into office. And all the prosecutors that were candidates said wonderful things, and I just didn't understand how we could measure that. And so as a project, we decided to just do some court watching to like bring the community into the court and to also see exactly what the prosecutors actually did. I knew what they did as an impacted person who's actually been on the other side of the defendant table, but I don't think that the many people in the public actually knew what prosecutors did. And we were asking people to vote for a progressive prosecutor when 90% of citizens don't understand their job or what they actually do unless they have to come in contact with them. And even then, they don't know. So we started the Court Watch project in Prince George's County in 2018, and it just grew into the movement that it is now. We have one in DC and one in Prince George's County that is ran completely by the community, where individuals go into the courtrooms each and every day. In Prince George's County, we have a focus around bail because our prosecutor at the time ran on ending cash bail, and she promised that her prosecutors wouldn't ask for bail, and we just didn't take her word for it. We wanted to be able to see that, and we wanted to hold them accountable. And when I tell you that when they saw us in the courtroom, it changed the culture immediately of not only the prosecutors, but also the judges. They paid attention to the fact that we were in the courtroom, that we were watching them, that we were holding them accountable, and it gave instant accountability and visibility to the work, and we were getting instant results. And as a result of court watching the courts since 2018, in Prince George's County in particular, we have been able to see those line prosecutors go from asking for bail to basically saying on record, I cannot and I will not ask for bail in this case. And we know that it simply is because that we are sitting in the courtrooms watching them, and they know that we will go right to the community and tell them that, which prosecutor, what date, what time, what case that they were asking bail for. And it didn't sit well with them. And so we were able to hold them accountable, and being able to do that. And it's also a way for the community to go into the courts and actually see outside of jury duty. Most people just don't know what goes on in a court, so mysterious inside of courtrooms. And so court watching is our way for being able to bring eyes from the community into the court, hold them accountable in real time, and being able to have real time results.
I love that concrete example of bail and actually making good on not requesting money bail, not because of, some campaign promise, but because there were literally eyes on the ground in the everyday. That's such a powerful example. So I see a whole lot of questions, reactions coming up in the chat. We're only going to have time perhaps for one or two of them. But here's one that I want to start with, and feel free, any of you who want to jump in and answer. So Leon Farquharson submitted a question. What's the best call to action for allies, professionals in the field, and those looking to get educated to assist people experiencing reform in the prison system or people who are recently released? So how can we help allies, folks in the field, people looking to get educated on like how to actually help people who are inside and help people coming home? Anyone want to take that first?
I can start. That's a great question. And I said it earlier, I'll say it again. There's a space for everyone in this movement. If folks have time on their hands, great, volunteer, sign up, become a member, look at different organizations that are doing the work in your community. And other folks, maybe all they can do is write a check, to support. Like the movement needs to get funded too, and so if that's how you could show up, great. A lot of so that's where I would start, and there are different communities, different groups are holding down different campaigns, and some of them may not necessarily be around DA specifically, but they might be around the campaign on shutting down a prison, or reducing the jail population number, or holding law enforcement accountable, in general. And all of those things are related, and so get involved, and I think there's a place for everyone in this movement. So
Thanks, Jose. Does anybody else want to add to that? Kiana, Rachel? Well, I can add to that to say one of the things that I do a lot of in my job at Vera is figure out how to get people who have never had the incredible misfortune of experiencing this system to understand just how devastating and brutal it is, and that that's not an accident, but that it's designed. Like the process really is the punishment. And it's court watch and just bringing people down to court, even just for half an hour. Because the thing that most people don't know is courtrooms are public spaces. They're our spaces. You just walk in, you sit there, and like everybody in the courtroom will look at you, be like, who's that? And there's just something about that that is so powerful. If folks are like, I don't really, I don't get why I should care about this, or where there's smoke, there's fire. If somebody does the time, they should, does the crime, they should do the time. Like I have family members who will sometimes say that to me. And for each and every one of them, when I have taken them down to court and we've sat there, it's just caused such a change of heart. So that's my very specific one thing anyone can do that I think is transformative, doesn't matter who you are. So another question that came up from Mark, in Multnomah County, Oregon, which is Portland, there's been a significant law and order narrative recently. I'd love to hear tips for reclaiming the narrative and keeping our fairly progressive DA. And for those of you, just to give a little bit more context, in Oregon, there was a ballot measure that passed 2 years ago to decriminalize drugs, and some of that was rolled back recently because the minute the new law went into effect, the backlash was intense, even though it was very clear that they really didn't give the new law a chance to work. They didn't do sort of all of the investment in community-based treatment that was supposed to be part of the law. It's just, again, reform is vulnerable to the narrative around it, even when it's not based in fact and it's based in hyperbole. So that is something that's happening in Multnomah County right now around the DA Mike Schmidt, something where we've heard, Rachel, you raised this, Jose, you did as well. What do you think, somebody who's a Portland, Oregon resident has a DA election coming up, what can they do?
Yeah, I am so grateful for the question, because I think, first of all, I would say that a lot of these themes come up across different jurisdictions where we see the same kind of playbook. Jose had mentioned Pamela Price, and we saw the recall organizing almost immediately after she took office. So I think one of the things that everyday people can do is really to correct false information, misinformation, and misunderstanding around what is in a DA's power and what is not, but also to correct a lot of the false narrative that comes up. So a lot of this spreads on social media, which we haven't really talked about, but social media, especially in light of the pandemic, plays such a big role in shaping a lot of everyday people's opinions. And so I think correcting some of that, engaging with Nextdoor, whatever kinds of sites where you're seeing misinformation or things blaming a DA for something that wasn't in their power, falsely asserting facts that something has led to crime when that is not true, misrepresentations around what happened in a particular case. It's so helpful to just talk to your neighbors, talk to people around you, correct things on social media, write letters to the editor when you see information being misrepresented or only one side of a story. And the other piece is to talk about the positive work. So learn more about what you can lift up and some of the success stories of what have happened due to positive reforms that have been implemented. So I think to create real narrative change, we need everyone to really combat the false information that's out there and talk to their communities face to face and online.
And can I just add to that?
Please.
100%. And I'll just say the biggest, one of the biggest assets that we have in terms of shifting the narrative is us. And I mean that in terms of us being credible messengers. And so I'll give you an example of my family, right? My family is a Mexican immigrant family, and they watch Spanish media a lot. And I don't know if y'all ever watch Spanish media, but it's off the hook. And the crime narrative is definitely there. And I've had many conversations with my family, right, as a credible messenger, right? Because it means something when it comes from me, right? Like if I sit down and talk to them and say, wait a minute, mom, wait a minute, uncle, tia, wait a minute, nana, like, let's talk about that. Look, it's not like that. They're just saying that, but like, look, these are the facts. This is me. I went through that. You know me, like do you really feel like you can't walk a block down the street in Oakland? Do you really feel that? No, I don't. Right. And like, I just say that like we're credible messengers. And so in our communities and our people and our folks, that's the biggest, strongest, like, because we can watch whatever we want on media. And a lot of it is clickbait, right? It's just like, oh, it's just out there and it's hyperbole and it exaggerates the issue. I'm not dismissing crime. I'm not dismissing that things don't happen, but is exaggerated. I'll say that for the most part. And so like we're credible messengers. And so in our communities with the folks that we engage with, the folks that trust us, it's on us, really.
Kiana, were you going to jump in?
Just organize. It's one of the oldest tactics. It was used by Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, all of our leaders. Organize, organize, organize. Find new and innovative ways to continue to organize. The only way that we are going to be able to continue to see changes is that we continue to have demands and that we do that within the power that we have as the people. And I think that, Jose did a good job of explaining that. And there was what's county was it? Oregon? Oh, they said they wanted to keep their progressive DA. You're not going to be able to do that without power and people, right? So continue to organize your church, organize your schools, organize your your doctor, and whoever you can organize and talk to, get folks organized. That's the best I can say.
I was going to jump into, and I completely agree. And part of that is also calling on legislators, calling on it for investments. I mean, part of what happened in Oregon there wasn't a real investment in the services needed and the treatment needed. And so taking it away from just these are not criminal justice problems oftentimes. These are social problems that need investment and communities and resources. And so call on legislators and other folks outside of the criminal justice system to step in and do their parts to really make communities safe and combat the false narrative that it's all driven by a prosecutor or that it's all even belongs in the criminal justice system, period.
I mean, those are such powerful points of organize, hold other electeds accountable to make good on solving social problems and not dumping them all on one scapegoat, and to have everyday conversations, because those are some of the most powerful ways that we change hearts and minds. So thank you so much, Rachel, Kiana, Jose, and Monique, who had to leave early. And just to wrap up, we're going to do a quick lightning round, 1 minute. We've talked a lot about what the challenges are. We have had some really good conversations about what solutions are, but I want to talk a little bit about hope and optimism, because we know hope is a discipline and we need it to keep going in this work. So what is your hope for efforts related to electing and holding reform prosecutors accountable? And in that, feel free to just name any efforts that you're working on, projects that you're working on, things you want to bring to the attention of the great people on this call.
I'll go first.
Please.
My hope is that we can tap into the 2.3 million folks that are still in cages and start to bring them home, and doing that and using the prosecutor's office to help us do that. I'm a part of the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, ran by Andrea James. And coming up, we are actually having a rally here in Washington, D.C. on April the 24th. Where we will be a 10-year anniversary, where we are again demanding Biden to grant clemencies for women who've been in cages for 25 plus years, and bringing them home and educating folks around that. And so the hope is that we can stop putting folks in but also taking a look at the folks who are in and bringing them home and meeting folks' needs, right? Making sure that folks have what they need to be able to succeed so that we can actually be much more safer in our communities.
Thanks for that, Kiana. Rachel, you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, it builds off. First of all, I completely agree with what Kiana said and appreciate those comments. And I think it's really important that prosecutors play a role in looking back, because a lot of what we're talking about, as you said so well earlier, is really about about policies that have been implemented a long time ago. I hope for narrative change, most of all, especially as we've just been talking about. And I hope that we don't get so afraid of losing more ground that we can actually start to make advancements in this space, because right now feels like, as Jose said, it feels very scary. But I'm hopeful that things will start to be change, and that we'll start to have an environment where folks feel like they can push forward again. And I think part of that, and part of my hope, is that there's more collaboration and spaces like this. I just came from a few days of a convening, bringing prosecutors with stakeholders, defenders, survivors, advocates, academics, to talk about their role in fighting for immigrant rights. And that was so powerful, and to have so many voices together, including line prosecutors who we were able to reach. So I really hope that we can bring more people into this work, and that's through everyone coming together. And the IIP hosts monthly webinars, in addition to other work that we do, to both the public and for prosecutors, to really understand different avenues for prosecutorial reform. You can sign up at prosecution.org, and you can get on our mailing list and hear about our other events.
Again, last but not least, Jose.
Yeah, plus one to what everyone has already said. And I think this is a very tumultuous and precarious year. And it really does feel like they're throwing the kitchen sink at us. But, whether we look at it on a macro level or on a national scale, I think we've been here before and we've prevailed, and so my hope is that, enough of us, we'll see reason, enough of us will see what's at stake and humanize, our currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, systems impacted folks, and understand that the system is flawed, that the system doesn't work, that the district attorney's office and to Monique's point earlier about the laws, they weren't designed for us. That this is a flawed system, and we need significant change. And I hope that enough people will see that and will not revert back to regressive approaches, regressive policies, regressive laws that actually cause more harm and actually keep us more unsafe than they do now. And my hope is that we listen to the folks on the ground, listen to the folks that have been saying this, the data, the science that says that in order for us to be safe, our needs have to be met, right? Our basic human needs have to be met, and we can invest in real solutions, real community, real public health, real jobs, real housing for folks, things that we know are going to keep us safe. My hope is that we can get there.
So what I love about this last piece is we're not ceding ground on the thing that we are always attacked for, which is safety. Like, we know what it takes to keep us safe, and we're owning it and leaning into it. And what I want to just remind everybody of is the reason we are facing these headwinds is because we're actually winning. Not just around prosecutors, but what I mean is we're winning to make ourselves more free, more safe, more just. We've got a long ways to go. And I thank you, Jose, Kiana, Rachel, Monique, for being part of this conversation, and to our friends at Working Families Power, Color of Change, and the ACLU for hosting. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate you hanging in there on a Thursday evening, afternoon for this conversation, and much work ahead. Take care. Good night.